Welcome to the Storypowers Podcast, the show about the power of stories, the people who tell them, and why you should be doing it too. I'm your host, keynote speaker and storytelling coach, Francisco Mahfuz. My guest today is Sage Tyrtle. Sage is a professional storyteller for hire, with over 15 years of teaching and performing before audiences of all sizes. She has won the Moth StorySlam multiple times and the GrandSLAM once. She has also appeared on the PBS show Stories from the Stage and been featured on NPR, CBC Radio, and many more. Sage comes across as the nicest person, but I also know that she hates hockey. She thinks children's folk tales are boring. In her storytelling workshops, sometimes she kills kittens. So this episode should definitely be interesting. Ladies and gentlemen, Sage Tyrtle. Sage, welcome to the show.
Hi there. Thank you so much for having me.
Are you just gonna let the killing kittens bit hang? I think maybe we need to tackle that one.
Uh, I I think that there's a tendency with people when they're telling true stories to feel like every single moment is precious. And I was teaching at Seneca College, and people were really struggling with how do I know what to cut out. So I ordered these little tiny kittens. Who are crazy adorable off of Etsy. And I gave out six of them. And then I had those six people tell the story of Little Red Riding Hood. And at the end of it, I asked the other people in the class, which kitten do we have to send to the farm? And they really hated doing it, even though it was just little teeny, stuffed kittens. Um, but it certainly stuck in their heads as right, sometimes you just have to cut it out and understand that unless it's adding to the climax, unless it's adding to the end, it is not relevant. And especially with oral storytelling, that's so important for people to understand that you have maybe 7 minutes and you are competing with people's phones, and people's phones are very attractive. They're meant to be addictive, right? That's how they're set up. So to cut it and cut it and cut it until you are giving the absolute essentials of the story, that's what's going to keep the audience excited by what you're saying.
So this is your very graphic, creative, and traumatizing version of "Kill Your Darlings."
Absolutely. And I will say, children they love it. Adults have a much harder time with it, but children are like, great. Can we send them all to the farm? No, just the one.
Yeah, so this is something I'm a parent of young children. So my oldest is now 5, and the youngest is almost 2. And you get to that point where you start thinking about life and death, and how much do you explain to these children what's really going on in the world. And they have older grandparents. In the next 10 to 15 years, we're going to have to tackle that for sure. And my oldest goes to a school that is incredibly advanced in many things, and they recently they talked about death. There was a whole thing that they talked about when she was 4 and something, and she got very used to the idea of the things die, although she keeps saying that someone is going to dive instead of die. And we have a cat who's 11, I think, and she was saying the other day, "Oh, I would really like a dog." And I was like, "Oh, we can't have a dog, because we live in an apartment. That's not easy. And also, we have parsley. While parsley is around, we can't have a dog." It's like, "Yes, but she's gonna dive one day, right? When she dives, we'll get a dog." And I
That's
was like,
great.
"You don't seem particularly upset about this idea."
That's
It's
great.
become very functional for her, I'm afraid.
Sure, sure.
um, Right. So before we get into the weeds of what exactly makes a story better or more engaging or more compelling, I just want to take a few steps back. And the first one is just clarify something I heard you talk about in another podcast, I believe, where you were just trying to draw a very clear line between what is a story and what is just an anecdote. Not necessarily what isn't a story, but an anecdote versus an actual story. So how do you draw that distinction?
So for me, stories must have a very strong balance. If you have a story that is almost entirely positive, awesome. That's stand-up comedy. If you have a story that's almost entirely negative, great, you have Schindler's List. And while that is an acclaimed movie for 1,000 good reasons, I have met one person in my entire life who has ever seen it twice. So, what we want when we are telling a story is to have a beautiful balance of negative and positive. Anecdotes are light, they're light on purpose. And certainly stand-up comics can keep an audience's attention for half an hour with a story about how they lost their keys. But for me personally, that is not storytelling. That's making people laugh. That's light and fun, but nobody's ever going to think 2 years later, I was so emotionally affected by that story about the keys. They might think I laughed a lot, but that's as exciting as it's going to get. Meanwhile, I have people come up to me on the street. I happen to have blue hair, so I'm very recognizable. And they'll say to me, I saw you tell a story 2 years ago. I still think about it. And that's because I'm making sure that there's a very clear balance. There's a lot of negative, there's a lot of positive, and when you have that, you have something that feels like real life. When nothing good ever happens, it doesn't feel like real life, but when nothing bad ever happens, it also doesn't feel like real life. So for me, that's a clear distinction, and I personally don't have a whole lot of interest in any kind of story that doesn't achieve that balance. I think it's vital.
I think given the last year, well, pretty much the last 2 years we've had, the story where it's almost all negative doesn't feel like real life. We might have to reevaluate that one slightly.
Well, okay, you say that, but I know so many amazing stories of people who, when they suddenly had limits to what they could or couldn't do, found amazing passions, found really fantastic ways, have adapted to this very difficult time in 1,000 exciting ways. So I think even now in the middle of a pandemic, even now as Omicron is looming, there's still so much positive, and uh, and and to embrace that, to embrace the balance rather than to say, oh, well, we're in a pandemic, so everything is negative. But people have, welcomed new babies into the world during this pandemic. Like there's some amazing joy that's happening that I personally would love to see get more
I mean,
attention.
I've had my favorite child in this pandemic, so Alice, if you're listening to this, I'm joking. Okay, why would you be listening to this? You're 5 years old, but who knows, right? The kids get into their phones quickly these days.
Sure.
Um, okay, so yeah, no, I think it's interesting because I don't disagree with you, but it's I think the first time I've seen someone make the distinction based on that criteria of the balance of positive and negative and emotional resonance, because a lot of people tend to talk about elements. So if it needs to have learning, tends to be one of the main things. Like if you can't learn anything from the story, if the characters haven't changed, so change and learning seems to be fairly common ones. And some people tend to think it's to do with a good one becomes a story, like a weak one is just an anecdote. But I hadn't seen that distinction being done on positives and negatives.
I will
Something
say
else
that
I heard you
that I
talk
do.
about. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. Oh, I was just going to
No,
say
no,
that
no,
I
no, no.
absolutely agree on change. Change is vital, but I think you can have change in an anecdote. So
Hmm. Yeah, the way I tend to see it is, I think the learning is the one that sticks with me usually. So because I always go back to this evolutionary thing of stories became are something that stayed with us for all this time because they had a purpose, and the purpose was, it wasn't just learning. There was a whole bunch of, there was bonding and there was entertainment, that was all part of it, the social aspects of it, but the learning of it, it was essentially what stories were for right in the beginning, or at least one of the things they were for. And to me, if someone says, they just tell me an amusing tale, but there's absolutely nothing to like, they're the same, it's just, oh, I went to this bar, there are lots of crazy people, you wouldn't believe what happened there. To me that's just an anecdote. Whereas
There's
they now see the world in a very different way because of what happened, then it has now become a story to me.
there's a sketch show. I will say it hasn't aged very well, but this specific sketch has. It's called the Catherine Tate Show, and one of her characters solely tells terrible stories. But what's very charming and sweet about this sketch is uh, that the one telling the terrible story is telling it as if it's Mission Impossible, and her husband is reacting as if it is the best story that he's ever heard in his life. And that's another teaching tool that I use. I actually show this sketch. I say, okay, what is wrong with this story? Because nothing ever happens to this woman. And she adds 1,000 irrelevant details, and the where she starts is never has anything to do with where she ends. And so yes, as I say, the sketch show has not aged well, but that specific sketch I still love.
Yeah, I have a friend who I had on the podcast recently, Darren Gibb, and he's done something similar on LinkedIn. He created this character called Storytelling Guru Steve, or Story Guru Steve, and I mean, I struggle to watch those videos that he puts out because they're so terrible. It's like 4 minutes, and the story is not going to go anywhere. There's only so much you want to see someone mangle a story. It's like,
Yeah.
at least for me, like I get the point, but it is
Well,
a very
I'm sure
painful
with a
exercise.
5-year-old, I'm sure that you've heard those stories that, you're in a she's in a cave, and then 40 seconds later, now it's in the sky and there's a pony, and but there's a magical ring. 5-year-olds are my favorite storytellers. Their stories are not anything that I would personally tell, but to listen to them is amazing. Just the massive leaps that our brains are taking. And yeah, I think they're wonderful. I'd listen to those all day.
See, people. So I've heard you had. Believe I heard you say that you had an issue with the idea of everyone has a story, and I have an issue with this thing that people say all the time, which is like, we are born storytellers, and just look at children. Children tell stories all the time. I have children. The stories suck. They are awful. There is nothing you should like. If that evolution did not make those stories last, like that is not why they stayed with us all this time, because as you said, not only they leap from one thing to the other, it's the, oh, and this happened and this happened and this happened and this happened, and it's like, I so my again, my poor kid. So my kid loves stories. She loves me to tell them to her. She loves me to read them, and she likes to tell them. And my parents live in Brazil, so she wanted to tell my mom, her grandma, a story. And I said, but Alicia, it's, you have to go to the shower soon, and it's you've been on the phone with your grandma for a long time. Can you make it a quick story? And she's like, I'm not sure. I'll start today, and if I don't finish, then I can tell the rest tomorrow.
Amazing. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, my issue that I have with everybody has a story is, well, I think it's a big part of attempting to monetize storytelling rather than it being something beautiful that people share. My issue with it is, yeah, I do think everybody has a story. I think about 5% of those people are willing to tell that story. There's 1,000. There's so many reasons that people don't want to tell the important story, and that is totally cool. Tell the story that you're eager to tell, not the story that you feel somebody is, digging out of you. Uh, but I think because there's this monetizing of storytelling because people are watching television or looking on the internet and they're saying everybody has a story. Then there is this like, oh, well, I lost my keys once, so I should get up on stage and tell that story. so, so I do believe that everybody has a story. I just think almost nobody is willing to tell that story. Uh, and then to what you said about being a born storyteller, I read a wonderful article a few years ago, which was there is an idea that people are born with an innate talent, but very often when you think of somebody who is born with an innate talent like Mozart, you have no idea what they went through in order to get to the point where it looked like they were. And with Mozart, his father, from the point that he could walk, was forcing him to practice piano for hours and hours and hours every day. So that by the time he was 5, yeah, he was amazing because all he had done his whole life was piano. So I believe that you can teach storytelling. I don't think it's an innate talent. I think that it's something that you can absolutely learn. And if you're willing to immerse yourself in it uh, and listen to the stuff that's hard rather than the everybody has a story and the time you lost your keys is amazing. If you're willing to work really hard, you can be a preeminent storyteller. Absolutely, anybody can. But again, I don't think very many people are willing to put in the work that's required to get to that point.
The talent thing, I tend to find it kind of offensive because so I've been doing public speaking for a very long time, and unbeknownst to me, the best things I ever did were stories, and I had no idea I was doing any type of storytelling. But when I competed and I won things, it was always a story, and it took me a long time to figure out that that's what I was doing. But I know full well, and I have evidence that the stories I told even 2 or 3 years ago were like I knew nothing compared to the way to what I think I know now. Just yesterday I wanted to post something on social media about my uncle, who's like this super self-obsessed person, and he only talks about how great a cook he is, and eating with him involves him sharing every single aspect of how great a cook he is, and is this the best risotto you ever had, and this type of thing. And I knew that I had written that story in the book I wrote about public speaking a couple of years back, and I said, surely I can just like copy and paste, and that'll be that. It wasn't. I looked at it and I'm like, there is no dialogue in the story. Like it's just me. It's a decent story, but it's a lot of tell and no show, and it was way too long for social media as it was. And I'm like, I can do better than this. And I had the whole story, which was I don't know, it would have been like a page long or half a page long. I had it in like 12 lines of dialogue, and I know I couldn't have done that 2 years ago, which is why I didn't. And it took to do that, it took 10 storytelling books, it took doing 90 episodes of this podcast, it took talking to a ton of people that know this stuff. And then people go, oh, you're so talented. I'm like, no, like, I mean, I'm not hopeless, but this is like a lot of effort has gone into this thing. So yeah,
Yeah,
so
yeah. Tons and tons of hard work. That's where success comes from, not from, somebody being born from Zeus's forehead and becoming the goddess of wisdom. It's sitting down and putting in the hard work and being willing to fail also. And like you, I look at things I did 2 years ago and I think, oh, I could have done much better if I knew what I know now. Of course, I didn't then. So I think to be willing to say, okay, this is my absolute best right now, and in 2 years, I'm probably going to think I could have done better. But how exciting to be 2 years down the road and be like, wow, I've gotten so much better in those 2 years because I worked really hard in the interim.
talking about what you knew then and what you know now, my understanding is that You weren't born talented, and one of the first times you told the story, you almost caused your uncle Doug to crash the car and kill the family because it was so boring. Uh, but then
Absolutely.
I have also heard you say, well, first of all, like, are we actually allowed to do that? Not crash the car and kill the family, but when someone's story is that boring, I don't think that usually, if I say to them, listen, I will kill myself if I have to listen to the end of this story, I don't think most people's response is going to be, you know what? I should work on this. This is going to become my goal for the rest of my life, to become a much better storyteller and not potentially put my family's life in danger. I, 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 that feedback is not usually the way we want to give feedback to people who are, murderously boring
Absolutely.
with their storytelling.
Absolutely.
I
And
don't think
nobody
so.
nobody ever accused my family of being soft on each other. For me, it was, well, to briefly tell the story. I was telling a story in the car, and my uncle had been driving for a long time, and he said, "If you continue with this story, I will die of boredom, and then we'll all die because I'm driving the car." And I had that moment of, never telling a story again or doing what I did, which is to say, "Well, you tell it." And he did, and it was amazing. And that it was like a master class in storytelling, in which I went, "Oh, like you did with your story, where you said, oh, it was a page, but I could tell it in 12 lines." He told it briefly, but including all of the best parts, the marrow of it. And I wasn't a great storyteller the next day, but I had that in my head for years of, what do you need, what do you need, and to cut it down as I went. So that when the pandemic happened and stages disappeared, I did go to a lot of online storytelling shows, but was disappointed to find that it tended to be the same people who were there. So what I was hoping was to go from the Toronto audiences to an international audience, but it didn't happen that way. The same people who were interested in show A were interested in show B and C and D, and I didn't want to be part of a closed circle. I wanted to meet new people and find out new things. And so I said, all right, what can I do that doesn't involve online storytelling shows or stages in the middle of a pandemic? So I began to write, and I've found a lot of success just in the past year, which has been very exciting. But certainly, the fact that I can tell a story in 200 words that really affects other people is a definite outgrowth of knowing, okay, I have 5 minutes to get up on this stage and tell this story. What do I need? What's the marrow of it? Because cutting out what you don't need isn't about saying Little Red Riding Hood is you don't get up on stage and say, well, there was a girl and then there was a wolf and then there wasn't the end, right? It's not that. It's turning a wedding cake into a perfect lemon tart. That perfect lemon tart has all the same ingredients, but it is very small and very tasty. And you wouldn't want to eat six of them. You would only want that one little lemon tart. So yeah, certainly, while it was not the most pleasant experience I ever had, it has resonated throughout. I guess that happened about 35 years ago. So a a long part of my life.
So now that I think you mentioned this twice already, you talked about the marrow of the story. So, in your experience, and now correct me if I'm misquoting you, but I believe that you've summarized the most important things. If you had to, just I think it was four things, and I believe what you said was that the most important things for any story is that you need to tell it in order. It needs to have emotional connection, risk, and change. Now, tell it in order. I think it's straightforward enough. It's like it's not Pulp Fiction. You shouldn't be messing about the timelines when you tell a story.
Well, because
Change, I
oh,
think.
go
Yeah,
ahead.
go on. No. I was just gonna say
Sorry.
that, do that because then I want to move on for the tell it in order. So do your add to that, please.
Uh, People are not always paying laser attention, even if your story is amazing. So if you're telling about your grandmother in 1943 and then you suddenly leap forward and then you leap back and they're confused, then that's it. They're lost for the whole rest of the story. And so for oral storytelling, yeah, tell it in order, please God.
Yeah. So I don't think this is necessarily an exception to tell it in order, but I've gotten used to sometimes doing something that I know Marsha Shandur, who I had on the podcast, who I believe you know.
Yes.
She says you're her mentor. I don't know if this is an official relationship, but she says you're her storytelling mentor. And what she likes to do is say, start with action, and then if you have backtrack, just give the context or fill out the context slightly, but don't spend 30 seconds or a minute giving us context to then have some type of physical action or movement in the story. And I found that I can do that fairly easily, but I find that a lot of people get very confused when you tell them, like, can you just not start on that action and then give us in 2 lines all the context we needed to know so that that action makes sense. I found that some people don't, they struggle with that. I don't, their brain struggles to, like, well, can I just tell you what came before so you understand? It's like, yeah, you can, but it's
Well,
as
I,
it's
I
like.
think if you're reading a book or if you're watching Netflix, you're able to rewind, and you're not able to rewind with an oral story. And it is very easy to get distracted in the middle and to, uh, I've said 3 sentences, and now the audience member is like, "Did I feed the cat?" And now they've missed it. They've missed it and now they're lost. And you cannot get that person back because they probably aren't going to put in the brain power required to figure out what the hell you did while you were thinking about their cats. So yeah, I think we're a distractible society right now, and it is vital to go just in order. And I think also there's a tendency to try to be like a movie, and this is not what Marcia does at all. I think she's fantastic at what she does. So this is something completely different. To tell the end of the story and then to tell the beginning until you get to the end. Uh, I have never heard somebody get up on stage and do that and found it emotionally satisfying because I can predict the trajectory of the story, so nothing surprises me. So it doesn't matter if we're heading for, now I'm holding on to the elevator the elevator, the ladder of a helicopter, and there's a shark underneath me, because all I'm doing once they've rewound is figuring out how we're going to get there, which is not me enjoying the story. It's just me taking apart the radio and seeing how it works. Mostly when I'm not, mostly every single time that happens, I'm just bored and waiting for the story to be over. For me, it's a storytelling style that does not work. But
Yeah,
as
I
I
found.
say, nothing to do with what Marcia is
Yeah, no,
advocating.
I think what she talks about, and it's something I tend to tell people to do too, is just have some, time and place are very useful right at the beginning of the story because people can start that movie in their minds. But also I like the idea of some physical activity or some movement. So I remember I was talking about a story about putting together an IKEA wardrobe, and it was something like, I walked into the empty room of my new house, and I knew my wife, and I knew my wife was just wrong, because and then I just said I had just come back from IKEA or whatever. So I just I just dropped that there and then immediately filled out what the context was instead of saying,
Absolutely.
I had just moved to a new house. Or the one I like telling more is the one where I start saying the first time my girlfriend and I went skiing together, I found out she was cheating on me, and then like the whole story, like she wasn't cheating on me. The whole story is about how I'm building this. People are like, how is he gonna like how is the skiing gonna turn into her cheating on you? It has nothing to do with her. Like she's not cheating on me. That's kind of the whole idea. But yeah, I find that the I don't find that tell it in order tends to be a mistake I come across often that people don't. What I do find is that they want to fill up. They give you so much context before anything actually happens that is like, okay, can you tell me that in 2 lines? Because if you can tell me that in 2 lines, we can get to the interesting bits. Um,
Well,
okay, so
I think
yep.
I find Little Red Riding Hood a fantastic story to use as an example. The crocodile and the monkey also works beautifully here. The crocodile and the monkey are friends. The crocodile comes every day to visit Monkey, and uh, then Crocodile's mother decides that she wants to eat Monkey's heart. Crocodile goes to Monkey's island. They're halfway across to Crocodile's house in the lake when Crocodile admits what's happening. Monkey says, "Oh, shoot, I left my heart in the tree, so we got to go back." So the crocodile takes the monkey back. He goes up in the tree, and Crocodile has to go home with no monkey, and they are never friends again. So uh, that story and most folk tales is a really fantastic example of start with what's important to the climax and the end. How did the monkey get to the island? Who cares? How come the crocodile doesn't have a dad? Who cares? How did crocodile and monkey meet? Who cares? None of that is important. The only thing that's important that we know is that crocodile and monkey are friends. That's it. So Little Red Riding Hood, similarly, what was her first day at school like? Who cares? Where is her dad? Who cares? Why does her grandma live by herself in the woods? Who cares? None of that is important. And I think we get so involved in, but the audience will be wondering, but they really won't. If you are fascinating up there on stage, you can be explaining that you're a mermaid alien from outer space, and they are not going to question a thing. They just want to hear the story. So folktales are a wonderful place to look for how do you start and how much information do you give, and it's almost always about half of what you'd like to include.
Although it is fair to say that now that I read some of those to my children, they're horrible, 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 horrible things sometimes, and I'm caught trying to explain some of them. And I had this one where it was Rapunzel, and maybe this is just a translation I have. I have a weird like children's version of it with some cartoon characters that are popular back in Brazil, and essentially it's like the mother is pregnant. She wants the radishes that are being grown in the witch's garden. Then her husband steals the radishes. The witch catches him and says, "Well, I'm gonna kill you unless you give me your firstborn." And then she takes Rapunzel. And I was trying to explain this to a 3-year-old, and she was like, "Yeah, he made a very bad deal, a bad deal." She's like, "Oh, that sounds like a bad deal. Radishes for a baby." Yeah, I was like, "I don't think it was a good deal. No." It's like,
Yeah,
how do you?
yeah,
How,
that's
it's
the
like,
version I grew up
when they
with
see the
too.
when did they see the baby again? Not sure they saw the baby again. It's like, what?
Yeah, yeah.
The
I
whole
was
thing
I
is
was
just horrible.
so one of my most exciting story moments growing up. I was 11 and I came across a book called Red as Blood by Tanith Lee. And it was a retelling of all of the fairy tales that I had grown up with. And I read it and I went, "Oh, you could tell these in a different way." That that to me that I think was as formative as that moment with my uncle, to just say, these stories in which women are helpless, they're only important if they're beautiful, in which men have nothing to do except save beautiful women, in which men and women have no interest in each other's minds. You don't have to have any of that. You can take the amazing, awesome part of somebody. Defeating a wolf. It doesn't have to be the lumberjack who comes in and defeats the wolf. Give Little Red Riding Hood a knife, and then she saves her grandmother. I noticed recently that you never see a woman who is unrelated to another woman saving her, ever. I've seen it one time, and I'm 49 years old. And the idea that you can take what's exquisite and exciting about fairy tales and tell it in a way that says to not just little girls, not just little boys, but all the kids, gender roles are nonsense. You don't need to be fulfilling any of this. Beauty doesn't matter. What matters is being smart. What matters is being kind. What matters is being funny. What matters is your behavior. All of it. Bravery, women are never brave in fairy tales, and so to read Tameth Lee and say, oh, right, there are other ways of looking at this. I think the one that really got me was The Frog Prince, because I had read that story before without ever thinking about it. And Tanith Lee's version is she loses the ball in the well, and the frog in the well is holding it and saying, "Yeah, I'll give it back to you, but you have to do all of these things for me." And she says, "Yes, I will do that." And then you really start to get it. Oh, this is horrific. He wants her to hold him in her lap all the time. He wants her to share his food or her food with him. He wants her to have him sleep in the bed. And then when he does turn into a prince, he's a super creepy evil prince who spirits her away in his super creepy evil carriage. Yeah, I think there's so many horrific messages that are being transmitted to girls and boys in fairy tales, and to it just felt so exciting, and it still does, all these years later, to say, right, this doesn't have to be the narrative that happens for kids. You can do something new, you can do something different. Free to Be You and Me was another big exciting moment for me, in which they told the story of Atalanta, and at the end, in the story of Atalanta, she says, I won't marry anybody unless he can beat me in a foot race. And then somebody does beat her in a foot race, and she marries him, and that's the end of the story. Free to Be You and Me, they're in a foot race, and they're racing and they're racing. They come in at exactly the same time. So here I am, 5 years old. I'm listening to the audio tape of, the cassette tape at my little Montessori school. And I'm like, and then they'll get married. And the end of the story, and I'm going to get teary saying this because it's such a beautiful end, is, and maybe they got married and maybe they didn't. They went on adventures. They stayed friends. I was like, "Oh, that's a thing? That's amazing."
So what you are saying is that folk tales and fairy tales do not need to be a dystopian patriarchy, and that
Yeah.
Frozen, in spite of what some people think, is not a feminist masterpiece.
Yeah, I couldn't point to any Disney anything that was a
But,
feminist
it- but
masterpiece.
something that is, I mean, this should have happened 30 years ago, but I find it incredible how it's finally happening with, for example, superheroes. So there was this big controversy back home in Brazil a few months ago, because I think DC announced that the current Superman, which is like Superman's son, is going to be bisexual, and they showed like some images of him kissing his one his boyfriend or whatever. And then some sports people like started having a nervous breakdown because Superman might like men or whatever. And that became a big thing. And and I think now that you have a whole bunch of other superheroes coming out as queer and stuff like that. But at the same time, how come Wonder Woman is not a lesbian? She's grown up in like all of the women. They chose not to have men around.
Right,
That's
right.
it. They've lived for how long? It is like no one. There's not one couple in that whole movie. Like
Yeah.
like maybe she doesn't need to be, but like not one. Like who are you fooling here?
It's an
Anyway.
odd time to be alive because you have these wonderful moments where Superman is has a boyfriend, but then you have this like backlash where I'm like, what year do they think it is? It's
Yeah.
like and also the people who are upset about it, like what why? Like Superman wants to have a boyfriend. Awesome. Superman wants to have a girlfriend. Awesome. Superman wants to have a non binary, platonic, sometimes romantic partner. Awesome. Like, great.
What I
Let's,
love is this.
you
What I
know,
love is this. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Well, he can fly around the world and turn back time, but you think him fencing a guy is a
oh, that's
problem.
amazing. That's amazing. That is
where
very, very
where
funny.
where people draw the line of what's believable in a story
Yeah.
is quite
Yeah.
incredible.
That's fantastic.
But anyway, so okay, so we had one of the things was tell it in order. The other thing was so change. We kind of talked a bit about that one, and then you had the other 2 points I think you had mentioned were having an emotional connection and risk. When you say risk, I'm gonna take a guess here and say that you're not talking about danger the way most people would understand danger, right? It's not like it doesn't need to be an adventure where someone's where your uncle is gonna kill the whole family because your stories are so boring. That's not the
Yeah.
risk you are
Yeah.
talking about,
That's
right?
not the risk I'm talking about. And one of my all-time favorite stories actually does it's a true story, and I won't retell it as it's not my story, but I'll talk about it in a vague way. Uh, the person who is telling the story, their life is in real imminent danger because of a really scary political situation and the position that their family holds. And that story has almost no action in it. It takes place entirely inside a 6-year-old girl's ideas and opinions of what's going on around her, and it is one of my all-time favorite stories that I've ever heard. There's another story about that has a woman who buys a lipstick, and that is the only thing that happens, and it has risk, it has change, it has emotional connection. I always cry when I hear this story because it is so good, because it's talking about something bigger. That is not a story about lipstick. It's a story about immigration. It's a story about uh, uh, being a refugee. It's a story about male female relationships. It's a story about being a child and seeing your whole cultural landscape shift, right? That's what it's about, even though the only thing that happens is the lipstick. So yeah, when I say risk, it could be a story about a woman buying a lipstick, but there has to be something that 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 is at stake. What's at stake in that story about the lipstick is this woman's identity, this woman's progressing into a completely new life in a completely new country, this woman's marriage. Like, there's so much that's at stake in this story that, even though I've heard it a bunch of times, I am always on the edge of my seat. I know it's going to happen, and it doesn't matter. It's such a good story. So yeah, I think risk can be looked at as, you know, it's got to be about something bigger. If it's just about losing your keys, then it's a fun anecdote to tell your friends around the table at a coffee shop. But it's the bigger stories that belong on stage. It's the bigger stories that make you a storyteller.
So the way I've described that, just to get away from the language of stakes, which I think once you immerse yourself into storytelling, I think you automatically get right. The moment you say stakes, you don't need to say anything else. Does the story have stakes? No, it doesn't. I think to some people they might struggle with what those stakes are. So I have described that, and I said there needs to be a problem that the characters care about. That's it. If they don't care about it, then you are not going to either. Now, if
Right.
you
and
don't
and
have that, then you got nothing. And I've
yeah.
had people tell me like, oh, it's just like I'm trying to run a marathon and whatever. And I'm like, okay, I can see you struggling to run a marathon, but I don't understand why that matters. Like, what happens if you don't run the marathon? Oh, maybe there was you were trying to help a charity and that is super important to you. Maybe it's just because your whole self identity is based on that you are an athlete or whatever it might be. But why do you care about it other than, well, it sucks if I don't finish? Because if it
Right.
sucks if I don't finish,
Exactly.
that's not a story you need to be telling anybody, really.
Yeah, yeah, I'm with you. The thing with I've lost my keys. Okay, if there is a baby who is about to drink bleach in the house and you're outside and you've lost your keys, now I care that you lost your keys. If there's a fire and you have to go in and put it out, there has to be, as you say, a problem that you care about in a
if
deeper
if
way.
if your relationship is in the rocks and you're arriving at 3 o'clock in the morning drunk, hoping to sneak back in bed and pretend you've been there for a lot longer, and you've lost your keys, now all of a sudden that story has stakes. And I have clearly just come up with this scenario. This is not something that's ever happened to me or would happen to me, just to be completely clear here. Okay, fine. So I get risk. Now you have. I think the last one there was having an emotional connection, and that's the thing where there needs to be a connection there between those two things, right? Because what matters, the stakes that matter to the character, might not necessarily generate an emotional connection in the audience. So, in your view, what does generate that emotional connection?
Uh, so I grew up in the States and I only came to Canada in 2004. And though Canada and the US have a lot in common, there are aspects of Canada that are much more like the UK than like America. And one of them is in how emotional people are willing to be. So I didn't just grow up in America, I grew up in California. So I am I wear my heart on my sleeve, and everybody always knows exactly how I feel at any given moment. So to move to a place where emotions were viewed as, excuse me, uh, something that you didn't talk about, and then to have people come to me and say, "How do I tell a story?" That was the first thing I had to say was, "We don't care about that time you were frustrated at the airport because your flight was late. We don't care about that." And I think if you think about on Facebook, if somebody is complaining about their flight being late, you are way less likely to say, "Oh, tell me more," than you are when somebody is like, "I found a high-heeled shoe on my doorstep and it's not mine. Oh, now I'm interested. Tell me more about that." But I do not care about your flight being late or you whining about it. So I when I very first started out teaching storytelling, I would say, "All right, so let's make a list of emotions," and the Canadians would be like, irritated, frustrated, bored, and I'm like, These are not emotions. These are Facebook posts I am scrolling past. So for me, that's why the big emotional component has to be there, because I think there is a general, and of course not everybody, but a general idea here in Canada that nobody cares about your emotions. So you better talk about how irritated or frustrated or bored you were. That way you're completely keeping yourself from being vulnerable. But if you want to involve the audience in your emotional moment, then you have to be vulnerable. I don't mean that you need to be telling a story you're not ready to tell. You always have to have the emotional distance to tell the story that you're on stage telling. But when I perform my half-hour show that ends with me on the subway and a complete stranger telling me that I am the ugliest person he's ever seen in his life. And the best I could hope for is that somebody might find me acceptable someday. When I tell that story, I am emotionally ready to tell it, but I am also vulnerable in telling it. And because of that, whenever I tell that story on stage, I have tens of hundreds of people coming up to me saying that was amazing and we loved it. And that was because I was willing to get up in front of people and say, this awful thing happened to me and it was devastating. So, emotional connection means being vulnerable on stage when you are emotionally ready to be vulnerable, but never before. Never, ever before.
There's a shorthand to that idea that I picked up from, I think it was from Simon Raybould, who's he's a speaking coach and a presentations coach, and I had him on the podcast a while back, and he calls that scars, not scabs.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I
Mm. Yeah,
many years ago, I saw a young woman tell a story. She had 7 minutes to tell the story. 17 minutes in, she had the mic. It had a very long cord, and she was wandering around the audience asking various men. And then like my boyfriend, like he broke up with me, and now he won't call me. But like, um, should I call? You're a guy. Should I call him? And she put the mic to the guy. Like it, she was sobbing, and everybody was just like, "Please God, let this end." And that was a person who was not ready to tell that story. Absolutely not in any way.
yeah, the vulnerability thing, in some ways it feels like it's been done to death in the last few years, but at the same time a lot of people just don't get what it means. And I remember that when I was writing that part of my book, in which, well, there was a big part of the book was called, is called Bear, a Guide to Brutally Honest Public Speaking, and has like, the cover is like this Clark Kent type of character opening his shirt, and you can just see like the skeleton and a beating heart in there. And I came across, no, I came up with this idea of how wolves, and I think a lot of other wild animals, solve, the reason why they don't kill each other all the time is because of vulnerability. Is because, once two wolves are growling at each other, um if none of them backs off, then the only way that's going to be resolved is through violence. But the moment one of them shows themselves to be vulnerable, they show their throat, and say, fine, if you want to tear me to pieces, off you go. That's when it stops, and they go, okay, fine, we don't think you're a threat anymore. You've made yourself vulnerable. You're not a threat anymore. You can now join the pack. Now we can look after each other, because you stopped being a threat, because you stopped being aggressive. And this is what I think people don't necessarily get, that this is just like, see, I'm messed up too. And you're like, oh, welcome. We're all messed up. Come over here. Well, let me tell you about my problems. Whereas the opposite, which is the super competent, super successful, I've got it all figured out. It's just like, who is this alien? Right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know who you are. Which
Yeah.
is one reason why Superman, to come back to Superman, is such a horrible character, is that he has no, essentially no, there's no emotional vulnerability to him. And when he is vulnerable, it's not even him, it's like an alter ego of Superman. So it is just, there's no way you can possibly relate to him as a person. And even Clark Kent becomes a crappy way to do that, because you know that really he's not like that. This is like
Right.
the American teenage movie where the girl that is meant to be ugly, you know she's a knockout. You know
Mm,
that it's just
mm,
makeup and bad hair, and
right.
you know that if they just kind of, do hair and makeup on her, she's now striking. That, like, that doesn't work. Like, there's
Yeah.
no, like, you can't relate to that if that's something that you're concerned about yourself. Um, and I just don't think people get. And I do a lot of, I do work with a lot of business people, and they really struggle with the whole vulnerability thing, because, like, well, should I be telling about my daddy issues? I was like, well, you can,
Sure.
and that can actually work really well. But sometimes it's just something as simple as, you're going to talk about something where you were successful at the end, a project that ended up being well, but you share all the doubt, and you share all the wrong turns, and you share how it definitely looked hopeless at some point in there, and then you found the solution.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
not,
My
oh yeah, it's great.
my partner, when he was just starting out, he was 20 years old, and he was really struggling at work. And his boss took him aside and said, "Hey, let me tell you a story. I used to be a roadie for a rock band, and they weren't super popular, so it was like me. I was the roadie, and one night it was 3 o'clock in the morning, and they finished, and so now it's up to me to put everything away. And I got up on the stage, and I just felt like crying. It was, it was 1,000 cables and all the speakers, and I thought this will take forever, and I just want to go to sleep. But what could I do? I took the very first chord and I began to wind it. And I did that until everything was put away. So when you're feeling overwhelmed with that moment of trying to, it looks like it's just a tangled mess, pick up a chord and start winding it. And eventually you will get to the end. And I think that's a great example of in a business setting, somebody being willing to be vulnerable. And that was 30 years ago. My partner still tells that story as, here's how you can face a difficult situation. So yeah, I think it is possible to be vulnerable in a business setting, and not just be a success, but to really inspire other people.
And even if you are going to talk about your daddy issues, now that can go horribly wrong. There's It's not something you'd automatically suggest people do. But one exercise that I do when I'm giving training on say presentation skills is, I will have people do what's often called like a pathos speech. So something about like your biggest disappointment or your biggest fear or whatever. And with almost no exception, I because people are like, they hate doing it, they don't want to do it, they resist the idea, but know that because everybody else is going to do it, they go along and do it. And then you ask people afterwards, just like, like how do you feel about the person that has just spoken? And they say, oh, I just feel like I know them so much more, like I respect them more, I feel so much closer to them. And sometimes it's the most awful possible story that you would never want to tell anyone, and then they're like, oh no, I'd never like, I had such a different idea of who you were as a person, and now because you just told me this thing, now I feel like I really know you. So yeah.
Yeah,
It does
yeah,
work. I mean, Brené Brown does know what she's talking about.
totally.
I have sort of one last question to you, which is more of a stylistic question. And I have described this to people before, that the way they should tell stories is as if they are in a bar, not as if they were on Broadway. And I've heard, I think it was Matthew Dix that called this the dinner test. So, if you wouldn't tell it in those words with that type of tone of voice or gestures or whatever over dinner to a friend, then don't do it on stage. Now, your I've heard some of it. I've read some of your stories. I've heard you tell maybe 3 or 4 different stories live. And one thing that struck me about your style is that, by that definition, I'm not sure. Well, I don't know the conversations you have with your friends, but I'm not. I don't. I'm not sure that a lot of your stories would pass the dinner test, because I think the language at times is a lot more beautiful. There's a lot more metaphors. I don't. It doesn't strike me. Didn't seem unnatural in any way to me, but it was definitely not something I can imagine you just naturally sharing it in that exact way. So, what are your thoughts? I mean, based on what you do in your own performances, I get a feel for that. But do you think that the language you use when you tell a story should be as everyday, for most people, not necessarily for you, but should be as everyday as possible, or you don't have any issue with people being more literary with the way they tell stories?
I I think that I think that that there's a line between uh, I'm formulating what I'm trying to say. It's There are people who write their story as if it's a short story, then memorize it, then get up on stage and say the thing that they've memorized. Uh, it doesn't feel good to the audience because although they are not reading it off a piece of paper, they might as well be. My favorite story in connection with that is a performance I wasn't at but heard about years and years ago. A woman was reciting a 20-page poem. She got uh, 10 minutes in. She couldn't remember the next line. She went back and started at the beginning and then told the entire poem and did it correctly the second time. But that meant that the audience was sitting there for 40 minutes instead of 30 minutes because they had to hear the first 10 minutes twice. So that is such a perfect example to me of why you should never memorize your story, ever, ever, ever. Um, However, I bridle when I hear people say, "You must speak this way or fuck off." Well, who made you the king of storytelling or the queen of storytelling? If you want to speak in a more lyrical way, then do it. If you want to speak in a more everyday way, then do that. All I ask people to do is not to memorize, because. Because I think the way that you feel most comfortable telling a story is the way that's going to engage the audience the best. So if you feel comfortable being more lyrical, then do that. If you feel comfortable being more straightforward, then do that. But yeah, I think I do bridle with that. Do it this way, or you're not worthy of being on stage. That I doesn't
Sage,
sit well with me.
you might rethink that very reasonable and empathic approach to people's styles when you hear the 150th business person go up there and say, and so we struggled with our competitiveness against our competitors, and, and I'm having to say to them, first, what the hell are you talking about? Two, would you possibly ever talk that way if you were explaining this to a mate over dinner or at a bar or to one of your relatives? Like, you wouldn't use 9 out of the 10 words you just use. So can you maybe try that, and then you sound like a human? I've often said, can you do this again, but like a human being now? Uh, so
I think I think that there is a tendency to think of what's on paper and what is being said as identical. And although, as you say, my personal style is not dinner conversation, uh, when I adapt a story that I've told on stage for paper, they are very, very different, though they're telling exactly the same story. So I do think it's important to recognize that what will keep an audience's attention in a theater will not keep an audience's attention on paper, and vice versa. They are such different beasts, and they have so many different ways to make each one strong, but they do not translate. They don't translate directly. There must be changes made for either medium.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and I don't listen. I think when people are good, then there's no shortage of styles that work and work very well, and people will have their personal preferences, but I do tend to find, but the problem I'm fighting against is not the problem you are mentioning, and I'm not fully buy into the whole, don't write it down and then try to memorize it because it sounds like you've memorized a written text and that never comes across as natural. If you say it 10 times and once you've now kind of got it in your head, you want to write it down because for reference, sure, no problem. But you're writing down an oral story. You're not trying to tell a written story. They're very different things. To me, it's just the easiest way for me to cut the lingo or the corporate speak out of someone's storytelling or speaking is to just say, how would you tell it to a mate? Because if you
Yeah,
wouldn't tell it this way, then we have a bit of a problem here. Now, I'm not saying don't use, if there's a short, like one word that like if you want to say stakes and have explaining what stakes are over 30 seconds or a minute, just say stakes because everybody will understand what you're talking about. But um, don't say leverage your influence and 10x your impact when you're just trying to say you tell a better story.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Right, so on that note, I hear noises behind me, and I think some of these are joyful noises. And I know you said you don't want to hear about people's flights being late, but I think this one you won't mind. As we are on during the recording of this podcast, I have gotten two separate emails, and these two emails are the COVID tests that my wife and I just had to take before we go to Brazil to see our families tomorrow, and I can confirm now that both tests turned out to be negative.
Wonderful.
So we know we can actually pack now and go visit our families tomorrow, which will make the 5-year-old incredibly happy because she knows that people dive because of COVID, and she doesn't like she doesn't like the virus. It's very boring.
Yes, yes.
um, so if people want to find out more of your stuff, what's the best place for them to go?
The best place is tyrtle.com. I run a series of low cost writing workshops. 100% of the fee goes to the facilitator. They are £10, 17 Canadian dollars, about 14 American dollars. And they take place across a wide variety of time zones. So they accommodate a lot of people. We're also I say we, it's really just me. I'm also beginning a free writing group that's going to meet weekly. There are two versions, one for one sort of group of time zones and another for another group of time zones, which are open to everybody. And as I say, free. So I would be wonderful to see you at any of those workshops or at the writing group, which begins in late January.
I'll put that on the show notes, but for anyone who's too lazy to check them, her website is tyrtle.com, and turtle is spelled Tyrtle. So the same as the animal, but with a Y instead of U. Um, okay, Sage, thank you very much for your time. This was great fun.
Thank you so much. I had a ball. Thank you for having me.
All right, everyone, thanks for tuning in. Take care of yourselves, and until next time.